The January transfer window has opened, and today I'm joined by David Ornstein, JJ Bull and Jon Mackenzie to find out what transfers are actually happening right now. Right, there's a lot to get through today, David, but let's start with Arsenal's interest in Nico Williams. What can you tell me about that?
Mikel Arteta loves Nico Williams. It's a long-term admiration. He would have liked to have signed him in the past. He would really like to sign him in this January transfer window. But we all would like things in life that we can't have, and there is a good chance that he can't have Nico Williams because of the finances involved. He has a release clause that is active as we speak, which is just shy of 60 million euros. It fluctuates with inflation, and it has to be paid in one go, which is onerous for any club who wants him. He also earns a very good salary in Bilbao already. That salary would need to rise if he was going to move to the Premier League, which is another obstacle. You've got interest from, say, Chelsea too, who have tried to bring their wage bill down, as we know. He nearly joined Barcelona last summer, but the finances proved a stumbling block. He also is not agitating for a transfer, which is why many transfers do come about, because the players push. He's not pushing. Will he subsequently, say in the summer? Perhaps more likely than now, but he seems extremely settled. And that makes it a remote possibility, but it doesn't mean there's no interest in him.
JJ, David says we all want things in life. I know one of the things you mainly want is for Nico Williams to move to Arsenal. You think it's a great idea, don't you? You've been talking about it for ages. Why?
The reason I like Nico Williams so much is because he is an exceptional player, and there's a few individual reasons as to why he'd be so good for Arsenal. But if we look at what Arsenal currently have, we all know they have a front three. Now, the central forward is either Jesus or Havertz is over here, and they drop in and mix around in this sort of area here, maybe move it wide. But your two wide players who do a lot of the creating of chances and goal scoring for Arsenal. You've got Martinelli, whose skill set really is being explosive and running in behind. That's what he's good at, so really good in the counter. Saka is a very rare blend of being hugely creative but also really direct. You don't really get many players like Saka, and he's got this position nailed down. But Martinelli in particular is interesting because he's really good at bursting in behind. He's not great at dribbling when he's 1v1 or 2v1 with defenders who are blocking his path. And so what you end up having, especially with Saka and Martinelli in these positions, is because of the way Arsenal play, and everyone gets back into their defensive shape against them, they end up getting to these final third situations where, as you'll have seen lots of times before, they just end up passing it around in that sort of donut shape or the horseshoe shape like this. So what they could really do with is someone who can burst past a player from a stop-start position. And Williams has a different skill set to those players. He's an exceptional dribbler. He's very direct as well, so he can go inside and outside of fullback, which is really, really useful. But he can beat defenders in tight spaces. So when you're 1v1 against a deep block, you've got a player who can just burst that open, and they're really hard to find. And he does it a lot. He's got the third most take-ons in terms of dribbles, like take-ons, in the top 5 leagues in Europe. Interestingly, his numbers are down a little bit on last season, so his percentage of successful dribbles is down. I asked the Athletic's Dermot Corrigan what he thinks is the difference between Williams last season to now. He reckons there's a lot to do with the move to Barcelona that he wanted that maybe fell through, and there's a slight drop off in level. I don't know if that would make sense to everyone. Also, when Williams, he's mega fast. You'll remember how good he was in the Euros, especially against England. He comes in off the wing to score and runs in behind. You've got that option as well. He gives you tactical solutions because at Arsenal, like we know, you've got Saka and Martinelli. You can replace either of them with Williams. You battle him for a first team place. But because he can play on the inside and outside of a fullback, you can play him on the left or on the right. He's very two-footed, so you can get the benefits of him on either side, the tactical solution, but also you can play him to the middle. But the best thing about Williams is not even what he does on the pitch. I think it's that he is not yet at an elite club. So when you look at, I think Liverpool's a good example. When they were getting good from where they were when Klopp joined, they signed players who were at slightly, I don't know, belittle Athletic Bilbao, but a slightly smaller club.
Yep.
And so are not competing for the top titles, right? So
not the very highest level.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fair.
You want to have motivation and determination to get to the next level always, because otherwise once you reach the top, then where'd you go?
That's my problem.
Well, exactly. So that's the thing. So then he suits Arsenal because his skill set is exactly what they need for their final third, breaking down low blocks. He's also amazing at playing in a defensive team who are really compact and hard to break down. He's not yet at the level he could reach, and he's just one of those very few rare elite players not yet at an elite club, which will put Arsenal in for now for the sake of the transfer. I think he's just phenomenal. Any team would be very lucky to have him. in their 11.
You make a very compelling argument,
Yes.
JJ. Just to clarify before we move on, David, you think if this were to happen, it's more likely in the summer, not in January, right?
Absolutely. I'm led to believe it is almost certainly a summer deal if it happens. But it's important to say in this wild industry, never say never, because somebody may decide to pull the appropriate money out and convince him to move. There have been a whole host of suitors in for him. Liverpool considered him last summer. I think they decided against pursuing him, and I don't know if that interest is maintained. Tottenham have been there too. And as JJ says, this is a player that clearly appears to belong at the top. That would be his logical next step. And it's just about where and when.
Okay, cool. Fascinating. Well, listen, let's move on to talk about Manchester City. We did have a more refined question a couple of days ago, and it's worth saying at the outset, we're recording this on Thursday, the 9th of January, so things may well change in the intervening time before it's released. I was going to ask you about a specific player. Now I'm just going to ask you, what's happening at Manchester City? Because so many things have been talked about in the last 24 hours alone.
We may be refined, but they are not quite yet because it's a work in progress. They, coming into this transfer window, were known in the industry to almost be the catalyst because of what's happened, their circumstances, and their unprecedentedly bad form. So they've set about their business and targeted two main players initially. They are Omar Marmoush, who is a very impressive Egyptian international, striker, forward, 25 years old, and he's had a prolific season. Is he a one-season wonder? Many clubs have looked at him, been impressed, but have that slight reservation. And also, remarkably, for a 25-year-old, certain clubs feel that he is getting beyond the age that they would be looking for if they are committing the level of expense it will take. Word coming out of Germany is that Eintracht Frankfurt, who don't want to sell him, would demand something like 80 million euros. Right. Counter suggestions are that he will go for 50, 60 million euros. And then at the other end of the pitch, there is a very fine player at Lens, central defender, an Uzbekistan international. I don't know if there's ever been one of them in the Premier League, by the name of Abdukodir Khusanov. He is turning heads of many of the biggest clubs. He isn't the tallest centre-back, but he is very aggressive and extremely fast. And Lens have a financial shortfall, and they decided that they would trade him in this window. And they gave a mandate to the so-called super agent, Jorge Mendes, and he is overseeing this process, which Lens want to see a return of in excess of 40 million euros. City were keen throughout. The likes of Tottenham were aware of him, Newcastle too, but I don't think either of them have any intention of getting in a financial battle with Manchester City. And so those two deals are advancing kind of in unison, and City want to get them done. And at the same time, they're looking to bring in an even younger centre-half at 18 years old called Vitor Reis from Palmeiras in Brazil. He was subject to an offer recently from Brighton and Hove Albion, around 30 million euros, I think. Right. That was turned down by Palmeiras. It seems that Man City feel they can get there. There are suggestions that he's agreed personal terms with City, but the club-to-club part is still needed. And I've got to point out that he is a name that I hear mentioned by all of the leading Premier League clubs as someone they would like to bring in. And since the news emerged that Manchester City are stealing a march, there has been frustration across the English top flight and recruitment departments. Some of them are gutted because they wanted him, and it looks like they're not going to get him. Wow. And I wouldn't say that Manchester City's business would be done there, because I haven't talked about a midfielder. They've been linked with Edison at Atalanta. I don't think Atalanta have any intention of selling because they're trying to win the Italian title, Champions League. They're in good position too. And so that's an area to watch with them as well. And then it could have a knock-on effect for the rest of the Premier League, who may turn around and say, if City are doing business, we need to as well. We don't want them to steal a march on us. And it could have obviously a financial trickle down around Europe that allows other people to do business or solve their financial problems.
Okay, so not much then. No,
quiet.
I mean, the main thing I'm fascinated by about what you just said is that 30 million euros was turned down for a South American centre-back. That's I think tells you something about the state of the transfer market at the moment, doesn't it? John, let's start though, with Khusanov, who's the Uzbeki player that David was just talking about. Who is he? I've never heard of him before, and he's still quite young, isn't he?
Yeah, I think this is a really fun transfer because, like you say, we've not heard of him. He's not really on our radars. It's not someone we thought was going to be immediately moving to a club like Man City. So it almost feels like a throwback transfer to when something just comes out of nowhere and everyone has to learn very quickly about a player. So, and I think that when you have a look at him, as David said, Uzbek international, broke through in the under-20s. World Cup in 2023, so he's still only 20 now, so very young, and off the back of that, moved to Lens, spent a couple of seasons there, a bit part player last season. He was back up to Kevin Danso, who is one of their starting centre backs. And the idea was that Danso was going to move on to Roma in the summer, and Khusanov was just going to step in to fill his shoes. In the end, that transfer didn't go through with Danso, and so the idea was, well, I guess Khusanov is just going to continue playing as backup, but he's actually managed to break into the first team this season, and I think his numbers really show an improvement on what he was doing from the season before as well. So he's got pushing 1,000 minutes in Ligue 1 this season, and is looking like a player who can comfortably start. But I think what surprises me about this is that we've been talking about City wanting to, solve problems. I mean, obviously the age problem he solves because he's so young. But I suppose this presents his own problem in that he is very young. So the question is, how quickly can he start having an impact at Manchester City? And I think we underestimate youth in centre-backs in particular because, we're used to seeing players like Lamine Yamal coming through at a very young age in attacking positions.
Yeah, like centre-backs, it's saying it's so rare that they get many minutes ever. You can tell they're going to be good usually if they're already playing when they're young.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what's so interesting about Khusanov is you look at him and he's got all the tools to be a great centre-back. But I also think that experience is hugely important for centre-backs, which is why it's very surprising to see them come through so young. And it makes sense, right? Because a player like Lamine Yamal, you can allow him to be creative in forward areas and you sort of bake that into the team, and if he loses the ball, it's not the worst thing in the world. When it comes to centre-backs, if they make a mistake, it can often result in a goal. So consistency is way more important, I think, than doing outlier creative things. And you think to the best centre-backs in the Premier League, William Saliba, Virgil van Dijk, what they do, they occasionally pull off incredible moments, but actually what they're really good at is just being consistent all the time. So I think that's the thing with centre-backs that stands out to me, is that you almost have to be 22, 23 to have the amount of experience to make sure that you're able to read the game well, because you are doing a lot of interpretation.
On that, Saliba came to Arsenal at the age of 19 and then I think had 3 loan spells to the disappointment of many fans because he was seen as this generational talent. And even for a period when Wesley Fofana moved to Leicester and he was the teammate of Saliba at St Etienne, people thought, Fofana is superior to Saliba because Mikel Arteta didn't trust him at such a young age. And pretty much the only one that springs to mind was playing regularly in one of the top divisions in Europe at that tender age was Lenny Yoro. And Manchester United snapped him up. He's having his own adaptation issues because of the injury. It's such a rare thing, and that is why people I've spoken to around this transfer think that 1, he is still very raw, and 2, they're a little bit confused because they're not sure if he's ready for Manchester City's level. Yet Manchester City need transfers now, you would assume, to try and compete in what's been a disappointing season so far. What I think is an element in this is that City know it's been a disappointing season. They know that Pep Guardiola's committed for 2 more years, which indicates there's a rebuild needed, and they're starting some of the rebuild now, and Khusanov is seen as part of that.
Yeah, to illustrate what we're talking about, I've just drawn up the youngest centre-backs in the Premier League this season who have more than 800 minutes. I think it's a really interesting list. We've got Dean Huijsen at the top, who everyone is raving about right now. He's pushing 900 minutes so far, and we'll get more because Marco Senesi is injured at the moment. But in many respects, he wouldn't have had that many minutes had Marco Senesi not got injured. So he's a 19-year-old. Khusanov comes in between him and Colwill. So that would be that's just an indication of how young he is. There are other centre-backs who are young in the Premier League, but they're not getting that kind of exposure and that kind of minutes. You can see with Khusanov, he is raw. There's areas where he can learn from, and that maybe raises questions about whether or not City can play him straight away. So this is Khusanov here. He's on the outside centre-back on the left in a back 5. And what's going to happen is we're going to get Hakim Hakimi 1v1 against him. This is sort of standard situation where you can actually read how well a defender is going to defend the space in particular. Now, in this situation, what you want to do as a defender is move the player on the ball away from the goal and put them into an area where it's harder for them to create from. So what you want to do is move them into the wide area here, I would say. And especially in this situation, as you can see, there's a big space between the centre-back and Khusanov himself.
Which you want the centre-back to be aware of.
Sure,
without looking, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
And that's what Khusanov does, right? So what he's doing here is he's angling his body in order to show Hakimi down into the corner, towards the corner flag.
Yeah.
But as you can see, the problem is that his positioning is a little bit off. So what he's actually doing here is showing that space that should be defended, and Hakimi, as a great attacking player, is just going to read that space and say, that's where I need to be. So you can see already Hakimi making the turn. I think Khusanov should actually be positioned much closer to this. This is some really great
Did you do your own Photoshop work?
No, I would like to make no comments on this.
I think we should pause and applaud for John.
good,
Because,
yeah.
congratulations, you've done a fine job.
But as you can see, if he's positioned here, he's blocking that space inside, showing the player down to the corner flag, and he has his body position then perfectly adjusted to be able to then defend the ball down the line. But because he is out of position, as we've said, Hakimi comes inside towards that space, and as a result, Khusanov then has to rotate his body almost 180 degrees round. So you can see before it was pointing down towards the corner flag, now his body is angled to be pointing almost to the opposite side of the pitch. So it's a massive swing that he has to move his body around, and that obviously is going to cause momentum problems. And as a result of this, Hakimi now is going to go the other way. So he's managed to off-balance him, and he's going to go around the other way, and now Khusanov his body is positioned badly,
Sure.
so he doesn't now have the ability to push off his back foot and get defending back towards the line.
It's an ankle breaker, as they would say in the NBA.
It is. Now, it's worth saying that Khusanov still manages to get a decent effort of blocking the cross that comes in. And that's what we're talking about when we're saying he has the physical capabilities to be a great defender. But I think in this instance, you can see a really good example of him just having that one misplacement at the beginning of his position, which has led to a great player like Hakimi being able to just manipulate him, get around him. That's the sort of thing that he needs to iron out in terms of reading space. I think something that Pep Guardiola will be really good on. I think Pep Guardiola actually develops defenders really well, and there's been so many centre-backs that have come through who've looked great under him. But I don't think that it's going to be a sticking plaster solution there.
It's a very interesting situation with Manchester City, isn't it? Generally speaking, those players are not the names that I would have expected to hear halfway through a crisis season, but as David says, maybe it's getting one step ahead of a rebuild in the summer. Right, let's move on now to talk about Joshua Zirkzee, David, because there was, albeit not strictly speaking, a transfer update, although I guess in some ways it was, an issue of intention to remain, let's say.
I think there's been uncertainty around his immediate future because his transfer so far from Bologna hasn't really gone to plan. And there's a feeling inside United that maybe that was a mistake. But it is very early days, not least for him. And this story within the DealSheet focuses on him and his intentions, and despite reportedly a lot of interest building from elsewhere, Juventus, the Premier League, and perhaps that will evolve into something, he doesn't intend to leave at the time of recording.
Yep.
Things can change. So right now I don't expect him to leave Manchester United, and I was speaking to somebody at the club who sort of asked what the upside of him going at this point would be.
Yeah.
It's not like you're going to get much money. It's not like you're going to replace him that easily. And if you do, it's going to come at expense. So in certain cases, to have is to hold. And I think that the focus will be to extract improvement out of Zirkzee rather than trade him. The only caveat I would apply is if a situation arises that proves potentially advantageous to United to use Zirkzee as a make-weight, Juventus, Marcus Rashford, some other situation, it opens a door for them to do something they really want. Do they reflect on the period since his signing and say, come on, let's let him go and play in a different environment, less pressure, flourish, and then come back and we get the ball rolling from next summer? That's all hypothetical at the moment, and I think he will be staying.
I'm glad you framed it in that way, though, and we're going to come back and talk about this a bit later when we discuss Marcus Rashford. But I think often fans, supporters, that we can have a bit of a tendency when we're thinking about transfers to think about the logical sense from a footballing perspective, why it makes sense for the team buying a player, why it makes sense for a team selling a player. But as you point out so often during January, during the summers, half the time deals happen because it makes sense for the club or for like the broader context. So that's a really fun point to think about. JJ, let me just ask you about Zirkzee for a second, though, because there seems to be a general consensus, at least on the internet, where everything's bad, that Zirkzee isn't good enough to play at Manchester United. I don't think he's been particularly great watching him, but like I also don't see the evidence that other people seem to see for why he's so bad. Like, what do you think? Does that evidence exist?
I think it's almost like a misprofiling because he comes across as a striker, but he's not really a striker. He's never really scored that many goals through his career. He's not scored that many. He's kind of like a 9-goal-a-season striker, really. That's kind of what he does. Man United, when they were playing before, they were playing a 4-2-3-1, right? So when you sign him, I think the idea is largely that you could have a player that drops in to play in these midfield spaces and can then rotate and move around and have people moving in behind him. That's maybe the thinking why he was there.
Maybe even a rotation option for Fernandes as well at that time, right? When Fernandes was playing.
Yeah, I think that would work, yeah. Because at Bologna, that's what he was doing. He was dropping in a lot. So you'd often see him drop in, other people would go beyond him. Like Lewis Ferguson would end up beyond him quite a lot of the time. Good old Lewis Ferguson, love that guy. But yeah, it's the thing. And like Zirkzee's hugely creative. He's really technically proficient. Like he's a really good dribbler, he sees passes, he can thread passes through, but he kind of is like a creative midfielder, but in the body of a striker, because he's big, like David was talking about, he's got a big frame, but he's not really aggressive with it. How when you think of a striker, you think they're going to try and body a defender out the way, or he can do it, but he's more skillful with it, I'd say, and more filled with flair and guile.
Yeah.
And then the way he runs, I think a lot of people get caught up with what players look like.
Yes.
And so because he looks big and like he should be a real threat, he kind of sort of he chills through games.
Sure.
You know? He sort of glides through it and it looks like not what you want to see. You want to see, especially in England,
right,
where all the swords come from, you want them to be flying into tackles or like, you know, just showing a bit of something else. Like
I always think that retrospectively about Dimitar Berbatov, though, who now only exists in like TikTok highlight reels as one of the best players ever. But at the time, everyone was furious that he wouldn't run, you know?
That's it. I mean, but Zirkzee can't, he's a good example, actually. But then Berbatov can definitely play as the up-top striker. Sure. Zirkzee probably could. But you look at now what Amorim's going to do with him. If you've got a 3-4-3 they're playing. So the most likely situation for Zirkzee, I would say, is probably playing him off this left space here, which is where I think Fernandes is probably best. Or you could play him off of the right in this space here, but that's, I mean, I guess it's him versus Ahmed at the moment. So maybe in there, but he's right-footed. So then when you come inside here, if you're in this shape here and you get the overlap and you come inside, your options are, well, you can't really shoot because you're not going to score from there. It's not going to happen. Or you can try and play a pass to someone. Maybe that's what you do. It just limits you. But if you're here, you can go inside, outside. You can drop in and do all the sorts of things. But they don't have the players for it. It's kind of a player they don't need, a good squad player. But because he's still like a decent age with good resale value, I can play multiple positions. He's a good one to be able to sell. He's not. You don't need him. But I would say you can look at his international record. He's got 6 caps, and he's like 23 years old. And I think that tells its own story.
Okay. Well, listen, I asked in the Athletics Manchester United WhatsApp group, I popped a little poll in there to ask those fans, who are, I suppose, representative of Manchester United fans, although maybe slightly more sensible for being in the Athletics Manchester United WhatsApp group. Would they like to see Manchester United sell Zirkzee? I was actually a little surprised to see that 65% of them said no, they would like him to be retained. I did also ask, this isn't very revealing, but it was funny, if they could rate Zirkzee's performances out of 10 so far from this season, and most people just said 5. So thanks everyone in the Man United WhatsApp group. David, what about Kolo Muani? He's the next player I want to talk about.
Yes, and he will be one of the most talked about players in the January window, I suspect, because he's a big name. PSG would ideally like to sell him, but having signed him for a deal worth 90 million euros, they're not going to see a great return on that investment at the moment. What they could do as a second choice option would be a loan with an obligation to buy. Still, there'll be some reservations from clubs because that's the same as a permanent deal, really. It's just delaying the payment. So would it be a loan swap that would benefit PSG with the player coming in their direction, or do they eventually go down to a straight loan or a loan with an option to buy? There is interest, most pertinently right now, from Tottenham Hotspur, who have him as their top option to fill a versatile attacking role. Yeah. if they are to loan someone in, I don't think they would look to be bringing in somebody permanent just yet there. Manchester United are taking a close look at him as well. I think there's a bit of an issue on his salary and bringing that on board with their PSR situation, etc. And also Juventus, who seem to be linked with every attacker in the world right now. So there's no sort of concrete developments just yet, and typically he'll probably stay and undermine everything we say about him being one of the likely movers. But certainly it's one that the market is paying close attention to, and lots of people are talking about it and studying him and understanding that his profile offers something a bit different and potentially a player of the caliber that you don't tend to see available in the January market in particular. And when that level of player becomes available in the January market, it would be remiss of you not to look at it if you need to fill that position.
Okay, cool. So that's the situation as it stands. John, thinking about Manchester United and Tottenham's interest, tell me a bit about Kolo Muani. Which team do you think he would better suit, hypothetically?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting one from a structural point of view, right? Because we've just talked about Joshua Zirkzee and how do you fit him into that team? Because Manchester United are using a 3-4-3 system, which means that you're changing where the width comes from, essentially, right? Rather than most teams that we'll talk about in the Premier League having their width coming from wingers, what you're saying is these wingers are actually going to play almost as 10s. You're going to have almost a 2-10 system, and your width is going to come from wing backs. Whereas with a team like Tottenham, they're very much in that mould of we're going to have wide wingers, and what you're going to do is what we talked about when we talked about with Arsenal, right? You're going to end up with these scenarios where you want to get players in those situations, depending on your play style, generally who are going to be good against fullbacks, can go either way around a fullback. So the big question, I suppose, is which interpretation of width suits Muani better?
Yeah.
And I guess the obvious answer to that, given that he succeeded at Frankfurt under Oliver Glasner, who uses a 3-4-3, is that it's probably suits the narrower utilisation. I don't think he's a particularly Nico Williams like type player who's going to help a team break down low blocks necessarily from those wide areas. So the obvious, I would say the obvious place to send him would be Manchester United. That said, with Spurs, I think that at the moment Spurs are playing very transitional football, and I think Muani suits that kind of play as well. So if anyone watched the Spurs-Liverpool game in the Carabao Cup, that game did end up being quite open, quite transitional. And what I think Postecoglou teams try and do is, yes, they have intricate build-up, but once they get through the first few phases of build-up, they then have the license to be a lot more direct. So I think they brought in someone like Timo Werner, who is very much that type of player. And I think Kolo Muani would be able to function in that kind of system as well. The big question would be, when they come up against teams who then drop into a low block, how much is he going to add to that? But he is a fantastic player. I think he would work for both of these teams. It makes most sense, I would say, for Manchester United, just because we know that he works in that system. But I do think there's ways that you could use him in that Spurs system as well.
And there could be extra space in that Man United attacking line. Based on the conversation we're going to have next, I'm going to ask you about Marcus Rashford in a moment. But given that you already mentioned opportunism as it relates to Kolo Muani, let me take this opportunity to throw to Phil Hay to tell me something interesting that's happened this week, Phil. Huh?
I'm sure you'll have seen the post-match brawl that followed Wolverhampton Wanderers' defeat to Ipswich Town at Molineux last month. It was quite the melee, and if you were looking closely, you'll have noticed Wolves forward Mateus Cunha pulling a pair of glasses from the face of an Ipswich staff member. Cunha got a 2-game ban for that and an £80,000 fine. But what we learned this week was that he mitigated his punishment by writing to said Ipswich staff member and offering to buy him a new set of specs. Isn't that nice? You'll get all this content and more in the Athletic FC newsletter. If you want to sign up for free, click on the link below.
Right, I come to you now, David. Marcus Rashford. As I said, it's Thursday. This releases on a Saturday. Things can change, but what's happening as it stands?
Yeah, Marcus Rashford and Manchester United feels like an inevitable parting. That's not guaranteed. The door is still open to him at Manchester United. If he shows Ruben Amorim and the hierarchy, the levels that they expect on and off the pitch, that they're setting for all players, regardless of reputation. But there's clearly an openness at Old Trafford to seeing him go. And judging by Rashford's public comments, it would appear that he's ready for a fresh challenge and the next steps, to quote him. So we reported recently that Borussia Dortmund were among the clubs that are considering a move for Rashford. Alongside them, teams such as AC Milan, Juventus, and clubs in the Premier League. Dortmund's interesting because Manchester United have already worked with them on a similar situation exactly a year ago involving Jadon Sancho, and it was successful. That will probably carry appeal. Big questions need to be asked at Dortmund's end on whether they can afford this, because Rashford earns well in excess with bonuses of £325,000 a week. What portion of that would Manchester United be prepared to cover on a loan? What portion of that would the club that takes him be prepared to cover by obtaining him? His representatives, his brother and agent Dwayne Maynard, met with AC Milan in the week before we record this. We reported that on The Athletic. There are suggestions that he also went to see Juventus too. I'm sure there were and will be multiple other meetings as they explore various avenues. Also, conditions of a deal. Would you include an option to buy, an obligation to buy? Would Manchester United be open to that? Would Rashford like to? There were suggestions that he's turned down 3 offers from the Saudi Pro League. The Saudi Pro League pushed back on that and said, there have been no offers from us. So there's a lot at stake here, many sort of games being played, moving parts. But if you were to ask me, do I expect Marcus Rashford to depart Manchester United in the January transfer window, clip this up and take the mick out of me, custard pie moment? Yes, I do.
I hope that happens. I love it when people make fun of
box
you, David.
office.
Yeah. I'm going to pick up on one of these reports. AC Milan. Let's start with you, JJ. AC Milan. The reason I think this one is slightly strange is just because presumably the position that Marcus Rashford plays in currently is occupied by Rafael Leao, who I think might be considered a better player on current form. So it seems like an odd one to me. Do you think maybe it's just a case of January opportunism, potentially, always talk to good players that are available?
I think so, because sometimes it doesn't matter if they're a good tactical fit for your team. If there's a good player, a good footballer available, you find a way to work them in. It tends to not work out in the long term. Sure. But it does seem like if that player is available, you can get them in. Also, you have to remember that there's other things to consider, like Rashford's very, very famous and he'll have a huge world audience. You might bring other people to watch your football team as they come in. Yeah. It's a small commercial aspect of it. But I think the difference is, Leao's one of the players who could go and play elsewhere, another top club if he were to go. I don't know who would have the money for him just now. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it probably is just down to the level that Rashford has shown in the past. But it can be a lot of history bias in these players, because Rashford hasn't been the player that I remember of Marcus Rashford for quite a long time. For a couple of years, maybe. Yeah. So, what are you actually buying? Because it's interesting. Yeah. I wonder, David, do you think this is just an example of something where we mentioned this before? It might be less about whether it makes total footballing tactical sense. It might just be that the deal is the thing that could be, the opportunity could be the thing that is enticing these teams.
It will all rest on the deal, and the enticement comes from the level that he's displayed in the past. Pep Guardiola, even historically, has really liked him. There are people I speak to at Arsenal, and Tottenham have been linked with him in recent days. I think similar to the Kolo Muani point, if you're looking to strengthen your attack, and you look at the options available, and you look at somebody like Marcus Rashford, is it negligent of you to say no? You at least delve into it further. Now, there have been suggestions of problems away from the field, on the training pitch. You need to explore all of those avenues. But it doesn't surprise me at all that clubs everywhere are surveying players that they could get hold of and their potential productivity, and turning to somebody like Marcus Rashford and saying, we'll have a bit of that, because capability-wise, he is elite. I think on Rashford's part, around him anyway, there's a feeling that he's been a little bit neglected, misused. When he had that 30-goal season, Manchester United then signed Rasmus Højlund, and he was shunted into a different position. He, for a long time prior to that, was taking free kicks and penalties. Bruno Fernandes was signed, and Marcus Rashford got moved off of them. And a little bit of a sense of injustice that maybe the homegrown player, the academy graduate, is taken for granted. And now we're seeing the repercussions of maybe a lot of footballing factors and non-footballing factors. The contract he was awarded, which has been scrutinised quite heavily, whether they should have done it, whether they were right to. And I'm aware from my journalism that Manchester United have been quite open for quite some years to offers, interest in Marcus Rashford. If it had come at a certain price, then they would have definitely considered it. He was heavily linked with Barcelona, with Paris Saint-Germain years ago, around the time where he scored the penalty in the Parc des Princes, and PSG were among many European teams that thought the world of Marcus Rashford. Yes, he's had a difficult period, but those people don't forget, and that's why there's a market.
Fascinating stuff there, David. Thank you so much, and thanks for all your hard work through the month of January, because of course The Athletic's deal sheet will be releasing every Tuesday morning throughout the month, where you can read David's work and the work of so many other fantastic journalists that The Athletic have, full of exciting, juicy morsels and transfer stories. So check that out, and we'll be back next week with another show about, I don't know what it will be about.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.